The Name Day by Saki. Adventures, according to the proverb, are to the adventurous. Quite as often they are to the non-adventurous, to the retiring, to the constitutionally timid. John James Abbleway had been endowed by nature with the sort of disposition that instinctively avoids car-list intrigues, slum crusades, the tracking of wounded wild beasts, and the moving of hostile amendments at political meetings. If a mad dog or a mad mullah had come his way, he would have surrendered the way without hesitation. At school he had unwillingly acquired a thorough knowledge of the German tongue out of deference to the plainly expressed wishes of a foreign languages master, who, though he taught modern subjects, employed old-fashioned methods in driving his lessons home. It was this enforced familiarity with an important commercial language which thrust Abbleway in later years into strange lands, where adventures were less easy to guard against than in the ordered atmosphere of an English country town. The firm that he worked for saw fit to send him one day on a prosaic business errand to the far city of Vienna, and, having sent him there, continued to keep him there, still engaged in humdrum affairs of commerce, but with the possibilities of romance and adventure, or even misadventure, jostling at his elbow. After 2.5 years of exile, however, John James Abbleway had embarked on only one hazardous undertaking, and that was of an age which would assuredly have overtaken him sooner or later if he had been leading a sheltered, stay-at-home existence at Dorking or Huntingdon. He fell placidly in love with a placidly lovable English girl, the sister of one of his commercial colleagues, who was improving her mind by a short trip to foreign parts, and in due course he was formally accepted as the young man she was engaged to. The further step by which she was to become Mrs. John Abbleway was to take place a 12-month hence in a town in the English Midlands, by which time the firm that employed John James would have no further need for his presence in the Austrian capital. It was early in April, 2 months after the installation of Abbleway as the young man Miss Penning was engaged to, when he received a letter from her, written from Venice. She was still peregrinating under the wing of her brother, and as the latter's business arrangements would take him across to Fiume for a day or two, she had conceived the idea that it would be rather jolly if John could obtain leave of absence and run down to the Adriatic coast to meet them. She had looked up the route on the map, and the journey did not appear likely to be expensive. Between the lines of her communication there lay a hint that if he really cared for her. Abbleway obtained leave of absence, and added a journey to Fiume to his life's adventures. He left Vienna on a cold, cheerless day. The flower shops were full of spring blooms, and the weekly organs of illustrated humour were full of spring topics, but the skies were heavy with clouds that looked like cotton wool that has been kept over long in a shop window. "Snow comes," said the train official to the station officials, and they agreed that snow was about to come. And it came, rapidly, plenteously. The train had not been more than an hour on its journey when the cotton wool clouds commenced to dissolve in a blinding downpour of snowflakes. The forest trees on either side of the line were speedily coated with a heavy white mantle. The telegraph wires became thick, glistening ropes. The line itself was buried more and more completely under a carpeting of snow, through which the not very powerful engine ploughed its way with increasing difficulty. The Vienna-Fiume line is scarcely the best equipped of the Austrian state railways, and Abbleway began to have serious fears for a breakdown. The train had slowed down to a painful and precarious crawl, and presently came to a halt at a spot where the drifting snow had accumulated in a formidable barrier. The engine made a special effort and broke through the obstruction, but in the course of another 20 minutes it was again held up. The process of breaking through was renewed, and the train doggedly resumed its way, encountering and surmounting fresh hindrances at frequent intervals. After a standstill of unusually long duration in a particularly deep drift, the compartment in which Abbleway was sitting gave a huge jerk and a lurch, and then seemed to remain stationary. It undoubtedly was not moving, and yet he could hear the puffing of the engine and the slow rumbling and jolting of wheels. The puffing and rumbling grew fainter, as though it were dying away through the agency of intervening distance. Abbleway suddenly gave vent to an exclamation of scandalized alarm, opened the window, and peered out into the snowstorm. The flakes perched on his eyelashes and blurred his vision, but he saw enough to help him realize what had happened. The engine had made a mighty plunge through the drift and had gone merrily forward, lightened the load of its rear carriage, whose coupling had snapped under the strain. Abbleway was alone, or almost alone, with a derelict railway wagon, in the heart of some Styrian or Croatian forest. In the third-class compartment next to his own he remembered to have seen a peasant woman who had entered the train at a small wayside station. With the exception of that woman, he exclaimed dramatically to himself, the nearest living beings are probably a pack of wolves. Before making his way to the third-class compartment to acquaint his fellow traveller with the extent of the disaster, Abbleway hurriedly pondered the question of the woman's nationality. He had acquired a smattering of Slavonic tongues during his residence in Vienna, and felt competent to grapple with several racial possibilities. If she is Croat or Serb or Bosniak, I shall be able to make her understand, he promised himself. If she is Magyar, heaven help me, we shall have to converse entirely by signs. He entered the carriage and made his momentous announcement in the best approach to Croat speech that he could achieve. "The train has broken away and left us." The woman shook her head with a movement that might be intended to convey resignation to the will of heaven, but probably meant non-comprehension. Abbleway repeated his information with variations of Slavonic tongues and generous displays of pantomime. "Ah," said the woman at last in German dialect, "the train has gone? We are left. Ah, so." She seemed about as much interested as though Abbleway had told her the result of the municipal elections in Amsterdam. "They will find out at some station, and when the line is clear of snow they will send an engine. It happens that way sometimes." "We may be here all night," exclaimed Abbleway. The woman nodded, as though she thought it was possible. "Are there wolves in these parts?" asked Abbleway hurriedly. "Many," said the woman. "Just outside this forest my aunt was devoured 3 years ago, as she was coming home from market. The horse and a young pig that was in the cart were eaten too. The horse was a very old one, but it was a beautiful young pig, oh, so fat. I cried when I heard that it was taken. They spare nothing." "They may attack us here," said Abbleway tremulously. "They could easily break in. These carriages are like matchwood. We may both be devoured." "You, perhaps," said the woman. "Not me." "Why not you?" demanded Abbleway. "It is the day of Saint Maria Kleopa, my name day. She would not allow me to be eaten by wolves on her day. Such a thing could not be thought of. You, yes, but not me." Abbleway changed the subject. "It is only afternoon now. If we are to be left here till morning we shall be starving." "I have here some good eatables," said the woman tranquilly. "On my festival day it is natural that I should have provision with me. I have 5 good blood sausages. In the town shops they cost 25 heller each. Things are dear in the town shops. I will give you 50 heller apiece for a couple of them," said Abbleway with some enthusiasm. "In a railway accident things become very dear," said the woman. "These blood sausages are 4 kronen apiece." "4 kronen!" exclaimed Abbleway. 4 kronen for a blood sausage! "You cannot get them any cheaper on this train," said the woman with relentless logic, "because there aren't any others to get. In Agram you can buy them cheaper, and in Paradise no doubt they will be given to us for nothing. But here they cost 4 kronen each. I have a small piece of Emmentaler cheese and a honey cake, and a piece of bread that I can let you have. That will be another 3 kronen, 11 kronen in all. There is a piece of ham, but that I cannot let you have on my name day." Abbleway wondered to himself what price she would have put on the ham, and hurried to pay her the 11 kronen, before her emergency tariff expanded into a famine tariff. As he was taking possession of his modest store of eatables, he suddenly heard a noise which set his heart thumping in a miserable fever of fear. There was a scraping and shuffling, as of some animal or animals trying to climb up to the footboard. In another moment, through the snow-encrusted glass of the carriage window, he saw a gaunt, prick-eared head, with gaping jaw and lolling tongue and gleaming teeth, and a second later another head shot up. "There are hundreds of them," whispered Abbleway. "They have scented us. They will tear the carriage to pieces. We shall be devoured." "Not me, on my name day. The Holy Maria Kleopa would not permit it," said the woman with provoking calm. The heads dropped down from the window, and an uncanny silence fell on the beleaguered carriage. Abbleway neither moved nor spoke. Perhaps the brutes had not clearly seen or winded the human occupants of the carriage, and had prowled away on some other errand of rapine. The long, torture-laden minutes passed slowly away. "It grows cold," said the woman suddenly, crossing over to the far end of the carriage, where the heads had appeared. "The heating apparatus does not work any longer. See, over there, beyond the trees, there is a chimney with smoke coming from it. It is not far, and the snow has nearly stopped. I shall find a path through the forest to that house with the chimney." "But the wolves!" exclaimed Abbleway. "They may—" "Not on my name day," said the woman obstinately, and before he could stop her she had opened the door and climbed down into the snow. A moment later he hid his face in his hands. Two gaunt, lean figures rushed upon her from the forest. No doubt she had courted her fate, but Abbleway had no wish to see a human being being torn to pieces and devoured before his eyes. When he looked at last, a new sensation of scandalized astonishment took possession of him. He had been straightly brought up in a small English town, and he was not prepared to be the witness of a miracle. The wolves were not doing anything worse to the woman than drench her with snow as they gambolled round her. A short, joyous bark revealed the clue to the situation. "Are those dogs?" he called weakly. "My cousin Carl's dogs, yes," she answered. "That is his inn, over beyond the trees. I knew it was there, but I did not want to take you there. He is always grasping with strangers. However, it grows too cold to remain in the train. Ah, see what comes!" A whistle sounded, and a relief engine made its appearance, snorting its way sulkily through the snow. Abbleway did not have the opportunity for finding out whether Carl was really avaricious. The She-Wolf. Leonard Bilsiter was one of those people who have failed to find this world attractive or interesting, and who have sought compensation in an unseen world of their own experience or imagination, or invention. Children do that sort of thing successfully, but children are content to convince themselves, and do not vulgarize their beliefs by trying to convince other people. Leonard Bilsiter's beliefs were for the few, that is to say, anyone who would listen to him. His dabblings in the unseen might not have carried him beyond the customary platitudes of the drawing-room visionary if accident had not reinforced his stock-in trade of mystical lore. In company with a friend who was interested in a Ural mining concern, he had made a trip across Eastern Europe at a moment when the great Russian railway strike was developing from a threat to a reality. Its outbreak caught him on the return journey, somewhere on the further side of Perm. And it was while waiting for a couple of days at a wayside station in a state of suspended locomotion that he made the acquaintance of a dealer in harness and metalware, who profitably whiled away the tedium of the long halt by initiating his English travelling companion in a fragmentary system of folklore that he had picked up from Trans-Baikal traders and natives. Leonard returned to his home circle garrulous about his Russian strike experiences, but oppressively reticent about certain dark mysteries, which he alluded to under the resounding title of Siberian Magic. The reticence wore off in a week or two under the influence of an entire lack of general curiosity, and Leonard began to make more detailed allusions to the enormous powers which this new esoteric force, to use his own description of it, conferred on the initiated few who knew how to wield it. His aunt, Cecilia Hoops, who loved sensation perhaps rather better than she loved the truth, gave him as clamorous an advertisement as anyone could wish for by retailing an account of how he had turned a vegetable marrow into a wood pigeon before her very eyes. As a manifestation of the possession of supernatural powers, the story was discounted in some quarters by the respect accorded to Mrs. Hoop's powers of imagination. However divided opinion might be on the question of Leonard's status as a wonder-worker or a charlatan, he certainly arrived at Mary Hampton's house party with a reputation for preeminence in one or other of those professions, and he was not disposed to shun such publicity as might fall to his share. Esoteric forces and unusual powers figured largely in whatever conversation he or his aunt had a share in, and his own performances, past and potential, were the subject of mysterious hints and dark avowals. "I wish you would turn me into a wolf, Mr. Bilsiter," said his hostess at luncheon the day after his arrival. "My dear Mary," said Colonel Hampton, "I never knew you had a craving in that direction." "A she-wolf, of course," continued Mrs. Hampton. It would be too confusing to change one's sex as well as one's species at a moment's notice. I don't think one should jest on these subjects, said Leonard. I'm not jesting, I'm quite serious, I assure you. Only don't do it today. We have only 8 available bridge players, and it would break up one of our tables. Tomorrow we shall be a larger party. Tomorrow night, after dinner. In our present imperfect understanding of these hidden forces, I think one should approach them with humbleness rather than mockery, observed Leonard, with such severity that the subject was forthwith dropped. Clovis Sangrail had sat unusually silent during the discussion on the possibilities of Siberian magic. After lunch, he sidetracked Lord Pabham into the comparative seclusion of the billiard-room, and delivered himself of a searching question. Have you such thing as a she-wolf in your collection of wild animals? A she-wolf of moderately good temper? Lord Pabham considered. There is Louisa, he said, a rather fine specimen of the timber wolf. I got her 2 years ago in exchange for some Arctic foxes. Most of my animals get to be fairly tame before they've been with me very long. I can say Louisa has an angelic temper, as she-wolves go. Why do you ask? I was wondering whether you would lend her to me for tomorrow night, said Clovis, with the careless solicitude of one who borrows a collar stud or a tennis racket. Tomorrow night? Yes, wolves are nocturnal animals, so the late hours won't hurt her, said Clovis, with the air of one who has taken everything into consideration. One of your men could bring her over from Pabham Park after dusk, and with a little help he ought to be able to smuggle her into the conservatory at the same moment that Mary Hampton makes an unobtrusive exit. Lord Pabham stared at Clovis for a moment, in pardonable bewilderment. Then his face broke into a wrinkled network of laughter. Oh, that's your game, is it? You're going to do a little Siberian magic on your own account. And is Mrs. Hampton willing to be a fellow conspirator? Mary has pledged to see me through with it, if you will guarantee Louisa's temper. I'll answer for Louisa, said Lord Pabham. By the following day the house party had swollen to larger proportions, and Bilsiter's instinct for self-advertisement expanded duly under the stimulant of an increased audience. At dinner that evening he held forth at length on the subject of unseen forces and untested powers, and his flow of impressive eloquence continued unabated while coffee was being served in the drawing-room, preparatory to a general migration to the card-room. His aunt ensured a respectful hearing for his utterances, but her sensation-loving soul hankered after something more dramatic than mere vocal demonstration. "Won't you do something to convince them of your powers, Leonard?" she pleaded. "Change something into another shape. He can, you know, if he only chooses to," she informed the company. "Oh, do," said Mavis Pellington earnestly, and her request was echoed by nearly everyone present. Even those who were not open to conviction were perfectly willing to be entertained by an exhibition of amateur conjuring. Leonard felt that something tangible was expected of him. "Has anyone present," he asked, "got a 3-penny bit or some small object of no particular value?" "You're surely not going to make coins disappear or something primitive of that sort," said Clovis contemptuously. "I think it very unkind of you not to carry out my suggestion of turning me into a wolf," said Mary Hampton, as she crossed over to the conservatory to give her macaws their usual tribute from the dessert dishes. "I have already warned you of the dangers of treating these powers in a mocking spirit," said Leonard solemnly. "I don't believe you can do it," laughed Mary provocatively from the conservatory. "I dare you to do it if you can. I defy you to turn me into a wolf." As she said this she was lost to view behind a clump of azaleas. "Mrs. Hampton," began Leonard with increased solemnity, but he got no further. A breath of chill air seemed to rush across the room, and at the same time the macaws broke forth into ear-splitting screams. "What on earth is the matter with those confounded birds, Mary?" exclaimed Colonel Hampton. At the same moment an even more piercing scream from Mavis Pellington stampeded the entire company from their seats. In various attitudes of helpless horror or instinctive defence they confronted the evil-looking grey beast that was peering at them from amid a setting of fern and azalea. Mrs. Hoops was the first to recover from the general chaos of fright and bewilderment. "Leonard!" she screamed shrilly to her nephew. "Turn it back into Mrs. Hampton at once! It may fly at us at any moment! Turn it back!" I don't know how to," faltered Leonard, who looked more scared and horrified than anyone. "What?" shouted Colonel Hampton. You've taken the abominable liberty of turning my wife into a wolf, and now you stand there calmly and say you can't turn her back again? To do strict justice to Leonard, calmness was not a distinguishing feature of his attitude at the moment. I assure you I didn't turn Mrs. Hampton into a wolf. Nothing was farther from my intentions, he protested. Then where is she now? And how came that animal into the conservatory? Demanded the Colonel. Of course, we must accept your assurance that you didn't turn Mrs. Hampton into a wolf, said Clovis politely, but you will agree that appearances are against you. Are we to have all these recriminations with that beast standing there ready to tear us to pieces? Wailed Mavis indignantly. Lord Pabham, you know a good deal about wild beasts, suggested Colonel Hampton. The wild beasts that I have been accustomed to, said Lord Pabham, have come with proper credentials from well-known dealers, or have been bred in my own menagerie. I've never before been confronted with an animal that walks unconcernedly out of an azalea bush, leaving a charming and popular hostess unaccounted for. As far as one can judge from outward characteristics, he continued, it has the appearance of a well-grown female of the North American timber wolf, a variety of the common species Canis lupus. Oh, never mind its Latin name, screamed Mavis, as the beast came a step or two further into the room. Can't you entice it away with food and shut it up where it can't do any harm? If it really is Mrs. Hampton, who has just had a very good dinner, I don't suppose food will appeal to it very strongly, said Clovis. Leonard, beseeched Mrs. Hoops tearfully, even if this is nothing of your doing, can't you use your great powers to turn this dreadful beast into something harmless before it bites us all? A rabbit or something. I don't suppose Colonel Hampton would care to have his wife turned into a succession of fancy animals, as though we were playing a round game with her, interposed Clovis. I absolutely forbid it, thundered the Colonel. Most wolves that I've had anything to do with have been inordinately fond of sugar, said Lord Pabham. If you like, I'll try the effect on this one. He took a piece of sugar from the saucer of his coffee cup and flung it to the expectant Louisa, who snapped it in mid-air. There was a sigh of relief from the company. A wolf that ate sugar, when it might at least have been employed in tearing macaws to pieces, had already shed some of its terrors. The sigh deepened to a gasp of thanksgiving when Lord Pabham decoyed the animal out of the room by a pretended largesse of further sugar. There was an instant rush to the vacated conservatory. There was no trace of Mrs. Hampton, except the plate containing the macaw's supper. The door is locked on the inside, exclaimed Clovis, who had deftly turned the key as he affected to test it. Everyone turned towards Bilsiter. If you haven't turned my wife into a wolf, said Colonel Hampton, will you kindly explain where she has disappeared to, since she obviously could not have gone through a locked door? I will not press you for an explanation of how a North American timber wolf suddenly appeared in the conservatory, but I think I have some right to inquire what has become of Mrs. Hampton. Bilsiter's reiterated disclaimer was met with a general murmur of impatient disbelief. I refuse to stay another hour under this roof, declared Mavis Pellington. If our hostess has really vanished out of human form, said Mrs. Hoops, none of the ladies of the party can very well remain. I absolutely decline to be chaperoned by a wolf. It's a she-wolf, said Clovis, soothingly. The correct etiquette to be observed under the unusual circumstances received no further elucidation. The sudden entry of Mary Hampton deprived the discussion of its immediate interest. Someone has mesmerized me, she exclaimed crossly. I found myself in the game larder, of all places, being fed with sugar by Lord Pabham. I hate being mesmerized, and the doctor has forbidden me to touch sugar. The situation was explained to her, as far as it is permitted of anything that could be called explanation. Then you really did turn me into a wolf, Mr. Bilsiter? She exclaimed excitedly. Would Leonard had burned the boat in which he might now have embarked on a sea of glory. He could only shake his head feebly. It was I who took that liberty, said Clovis. You see, I happen to have lived for a couple of years in northeastern Russia, and I have more than a tourist's acquaintance with the magic craft of that region. One does not care to speak about these strange powers, but once in a way, when one hears a lot of nonsense being talked about them, one is tempted to show what Siberian magic can accomplish in the hands of someone who really understands it. I yielded to that temptation. May I have some brandy? The effort has left me rather faint. If Leonard Bilsiter could at that moment have transformed Clovis into a cockroach and then stepped on him, he would gladly have performed both operations. The Interlopers. In a forest of mixed growth somewhere on the eastern spurs of the Carpathians, a man stood one winter night watching and listening, as though he waited for some beast of the woods to come within the range of his vision and, later, of his rifle. But the game for whose presence he kept so keen an outlook was none that figured in the sportsman's calendar as lawful and proper for the chase. Ulrich von Gradwitz patrolled the dark forest in quest of a human enemy. The forest lands of Gradwitz were of wide extent and well stocked with game. The narrow strip of precipitous woodland that lay on its outskirt was not remarkable for the game it harboured or the shooting it afforded, but it was the most jealously guarded of all its owner's territorial possessions. A famous lawsuit, in the days of his grandfather, had wrested it from the illegal possession of a neighbouring family of petty landowners. The dispossessed party had never acquiesced in the judgment of the courts, and a long series of poaching affrays and similar scandals had embittered the relationships between the families for 3 generations. The neighbour feud had grown into a personal one since Ulrich had come to be head of his family. If there was a man in the world whom he detested and wished ill to, George Znaeym, the inheritor of the quarrel and the tireless game-snatcher and raider of the disputed border forest. The feud might, perhaps, have died down or been compromised if the personal ill will of the 2 men had not stood in the way. As boys they had thirsted for one another's blood, as men each prayed that misfortune might fall on the other, and this wind-scourged winter night Ulrich had banded together his foresters to watch the dark forest, not in quest of 4-footed quarry, but to keep a lookout for the prowling thieves whom he suspected of being afoot from across the land boundary. The roebuck, which usually kept in the sheltered hollows during a storm wind, were running like driven things tonight. There was movement and unrest among the creatures that were wont to sleep through the dark hours. Assuredly there was a disturbing element in the forest, and Ulrich could guess the quarter from whence it came. He strayed away by himself from the watchers whom he had placed in ambush on the crest of the hill, and wandered far down the steep slopes amid the wild tangle of undergrowth, peering through the tree trunks and listening through the whistling and skirling of the wind and the relentless beating of the branches for sight and sound of the marauders. If only on this wild night, in this dark lone spot, he might come across George Znaeym, man to man, with none to witness, that was the wish that was uppermost in his thoughts. And as he stepped round the trunk of a huge beech, he came face to face with the man he sought. The 2 enemies stood glaring at one another for a long silent moment. Each had a rifle in his hand, each had hate in his heart and murder uppermost in his mind. The chance had come to give full play to the passions of a lifetime. But a man who has been brought up under the code of a restraining civilization cannot easily nerve himself to shoot down his neighbour in cold blood and without word spoken, except for an offence against his hearth and honour. And before the moment of hesitation had given way to action, a deed of nature's own violence overwhelmed them both. A fierce shriek of the storm had been answered by a splitting crash over their heads, and ere they could leap aside, a mass of falling beech tree had thundered down on them. Ulrich von Gradwitz found himself stretched on the ground, one arm numb beneath him, and the other held almost as helplessly in a tight tangle of forked branches, while both legs were pinned beneath the fallen mass. His heavy shooting boots had saved his feet from being crushed to pieces, but if his fractures were not as serious as they might have been, at least it was evident that he could not move from his present position till someone came to release him. The descending twig had slashed the skin of his face, and he had to wink away some drops of blood from his eyelashes before he could take in a general view of the disaster. At his side, so near that under ordinary circumstances he could almost have touched him, lay George Znaeym, alive and struggling, but obviously as helplessly pinioned down as himself. All around them lay a thick-strewn wreckage of splintered branches and broken twigs. Relief at being alive and exasperation at his captive plight brought a strange medley of pious thank-offerings and sharp curses to Ulrich's lips. George, who was early blinded with the blood which trickled across his eyes, stopped his struggling for a moment to listen, and then gave a short, snarling laugh. "So you're not killed, as you ought to be, but you're caught anyway," he cried. "Caught fast! Oh, what a jest! Ulrich von Gradwitz snared in his stolen forest. There's real justice for you." And he laughed again, mockingly and savagely. "I'm caught in my own forest land," retorted Ulrich. "When my men come to release us, you will wish, perhaps, that you were in a better plight than caught poaching on a neighbour's land. Shame on you!" George was silent for a moment. Then he answered quietly, "Are you sure that your men will find much to release?" "I have men, too, in the forest tonight, close behind me, and they will be here first and do the releasing. When they drag me out from under these damned branches, it won't need much clumsiness on their part to roll this mass of trunk right over on the top of you. Your men will find you dead under a fallen beech tree. For form's sake, I shall send my condolences to your family." "It is a useful hint," said Ulrich fiercely. "My men had orders to follow in 10 minutes' time, 7 of which must have gone by already, and when they get me out, I will remember the hint. Only, as you will have met your death poaching on my lands, I don't think I can decently send any message of condolence to your family." "Good," snarled George. "Good. We fight this quarrel out to the death, you and I and our foresters, with no cursed interlopers to come between us. Death and damnation to you, Ulrich von Gradwitz." "The same to you, George Znaim, forest thief, game snatcher." Both men spoke with the bitterness of possible defeat before them, for each knew that it might be long before his men would seek him out or find him. It was a bare matter of chance which party would arrive first on the scene. Both had now given up the useless struggle to free themselves from the mass of wood that held them down. Ulrich limited his endeavours to an effort to bring his one partially free arm near enough to his outer coat pocket to draw out his wine flask. Even when he had accomplished that operation, it was long before he could manage the unscrewing of the stopper or get any of the liquid down his throat. But what a heaven-sent draught it seemed! It was an open winter, and little snow had fallen as yet, hence the captives suffered less from the cold than might have been the case at that season of the year. Nevertheless, the wine was warming and reviving to the wounded man, and he looked across with something like a throb of pity to where his enemy lay, just keeping the groans of pain and weariness from crossing his lips. "Could you reach this flask if I threw it over to you?" asked Ulrich suddenly. "There is good wine in it, and one may as well be as comfortable as one can. Let us drink, even if tonight one of us dies." "No, I can scarcely see anything, there is so much blood caked round my eyes," said George, "and in any case I don't drink wine with an enemy." Ulrich was silent for a few minutes, and lay listening to the weary screeching of the wind. An idea was slowly forming and growing in his brain, an idea that gained strength every time that he looked across at the man who was fighting so grimly against pain and exhaustion. In the pain and languor that Ulrich himself was feeling, the old fierce hatred seemed to be dying down. "Neighbour," he said presently, "do as you please if your men come first. It was a fair compact, but as for me, I've changed my mind. If my men are the first to come, you shall be the first to be helped, as though you were my guest. We have quarrelled like devils all our lives over this stupid strip of forest, where the trees can't even stand upright in a breath of wind. Lying here tonight thinking, I've come to think we've been rather fools. There are better things in life than getting the better of a boundary dispute. Neighbour, if you will help me to bury the old quarrel, I will ask you to be my friend." George Znaim was silent for so long that Ulrich thought perhaps he had fainted with the pain of his injuries. Then he spoke slowly and in jerks. "How the whole region would stare and gabble if we rode into the market square together. No one living can remember seeing a Znaim and a von Gradwitz talking to one another in friendship. And what peace there would be among the forester folk if we ended our feud tonight. And if we choose to make peace among our people, there is none other to interfere, no interlopers from outside. You would come and keep the Sylvester night beneath my roof, and I would come and feast on some high day at your castle. I would never fire a shot on your land, save when you invited me as a guest, and you should come and shoot with me down in the marshes, where the wildfowl are. In all the countryside there are none that could hinder, if we willed to make peace. I never thought to have wanted to do other than hate you all my life. But I think I have changed my mind about things too, this last half hour. And you offered me your wine flask. Ulrich von Gradwitz, I will be your friend. For a space both men were silent, turning over in their minds the wonderful changes that this dramatic reconciliation would bring about. In the cold, gloomy forest, with the wind tearing in fitful gusts through the naked branches and whistling round the tree trunks, they lay and waited for the help that would now bring release and succour to both parties. And each prayed a private prayer that his men might be the first to arrive, so that he might be the first to show honourable attention to the enemy that had become a friend. Presently, as the wind dropped for a moment, Ulrich broke silence. "Let's shout for help," he said. "In this lull our voices may carry a little." "They won't carry far through the trees and undergrowth," said George, "but we can try. Together then." The two raised their voices in a prolonged hunting call. "Together again," said Ulrich a few minutes later, after listening in vain for an answering hello. "I heard nothing but the pestilential wind," said George hoarsely. There was silence again for some minutes, and then Ulrich gave a joyful cry. "I can see figures coming through the wood. They are following the way I came down the hillside." Both men raised their voices in as loud a shout as they could muster. "They hear us! They've stopped! Now they see us! They're running down the hill towards us!" cried Ulrich. "How many of them are there?" asked George. "I can't see distinctly," said Ulrich. 9 or 10. "Then they are yours," said George. "I had only 7 out with me." "They are making all the speed they can, brave lads," said Ulrich gladly. "Are they your men?" asked George. "Are they your men?" he repeated impatiently, as Ulrich did not answer. "No," said Ulrich with a laugh, the idiotic chattering laugh of a man unstrung with hideous fear. "Who are they?" asked George quickly, straining his eyes to see what the other would gladly not have seen. "Wolves,"